It's great to be back, and I think this is my 12th time at the Summer Institute. I wrote a blog post about my experiences at the Summer Institute, if you're into that. And I want to thank David and Sandy for all their mentorship and love over the years. And I want to remind you that the corrections to the proofs of our sympathy volume are due on Tuesday and Wednesday. State. It will be in stores in 6 weeks or so, but you can pre-order from Amazon. There's a minor formatting issue. So a lot of Chicago economists will be cut off on the left. I don't know if that's...
George would approve.
I've actually have wanted to talk about LSE many times because I've read the 5 lectures at LSE religiously. But today LSE will play a role, but it's kind of a supporting role. But here's some LSE. The official attitude, of which Robbins is perhaps the best known contemporary exponent, now became more austere. The study of ends was held to be a problem in ethics, and the economist class scientist had no special competence in his field, even as applied to economic policy. Quite recently, there's been a return to the view that the treatment of welfare problems is an integral part of economic analysis. The new welfare economists claim that many policies can be shown to other economists to be good or bad without entering a dangerous quagmire of value judgments. Sandy, can you warn me about 10 minutes before 45 minutes?
Yeah.
Thank you. So this is from a 1943 paper that David and Sandy have called attention to in their new Palgrave thing. Actually uncited, not very well known otherwise, but I've made a fine scholarly career out of adding footnotes to it. The context is Stigler's criticism of the new welfare economics. Samuelson writes a very fierce response to it. According to the lore of the discipline, Samuelson wins that debate. But what's interesting is over time, Stigler keeps returning to the debate and adds new comments to it. So he himself didn't think he had lost the debate at all, but he did change his mind over time. So Stigler's diagnosis is this. There has been a split between economics and ethics, culminating in Robbins. I will kind of retrace this path and add some wrinkles to it, but I basically agree with George. It is an Anglo-centric story today. In the background, there's Max Weber and Menger, who will show up at various points. Parsons is a key interlocutor in all of this. I've told part of that story elsewhere. But there's a German and Germanic background to the account that I'm going to give that I'm not going to focus on today. Now, the self-image of the new welfare economics is that there's a scientific way to talk about values without being enmeshed in values. I'm going to take that for granted. I'm not going to argue for that today. And the 43 paper complicates that self-image, and I'm going to trace some of that, but again, I've actually talked about it elsewhere. And what Stigler alerts us to other economists, is that there is an other issue here, namely the role of expert communities in larger society. And what I want to do is I want to locate this piece into a larger story in which the famous about values we don't fight paper, well, we talk about, well, whatever. I should never translate from Latin in the morning when I'm jet lagged. As I want to trace a larger story in which there's an evolution in Stigler's thoughts on these issues as well. And I want to make that kind of stand for a larger set of transformations in the economics discipline, knowing full well that there are a lot of complications and that Chicago doesn't stand for the whole discipline. But in an interesting way, the evolution of thought in Chicago from, say, Knight to Stigler-Becker is emblematic for a larger technocratic conception of economics. And that, I think, Chicago is very helpful at bringing out. Hi, Greg. Okay, so this is a famous passage, again, cut off on the left. Many countries around the world are today experiencing socially destructive inflation, abnormally high unemployment, misuse of economic resources, and in some cases the suppression of human freedom, not because evil men deliberately sought to achieve these results, nor because of differences in values among their citizens, but because of erroneous judgments about the consequences of government measures, errors that at least are in principle capable of being corrected by the progress of positive economic science. Okay, so my sly gloss on this, we agree, and when we don't, it's because of scientific ignorance, right? Now, the context is very, 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 very charged. It's the Nobel lecture, but as you may well know, the Chilean situation had blown up in Friedman's face. Orlando Letelier had been assassinated a few weeks before. But what I want to focus on is the content of the claim here. There's a sharp distinction between economic facts and values, well-known distinction that Friedman himself helped popularize. Preventable mistakes about policy impacts lead to social problems. Progress in economic science can prevent social, oh, I got really excited about this. And it presupposes value unanimity, right? And wanted free together is what I'm going to call and stipulate the technocratic ideal of politics. You're allowed to interrupt at any time, by the way. This is the Summer Institute. Right? So I want to say one for free, that I'm going to stipulate is what a technocratic ideal of politics is. I'm not the first to suggest this. Go to Frankfurt Schule, Habermas, Adorno, Horkheimer, Marcuse, etc. What's unusual is that I want to, yes, Andrew.
Yeah, super quick. What would be a concrete example of the kind of value unanimity you say Friedman's presupposing?
So the nice thing is, and I'll show this, is that it goes in the other direction. Working society entails value unanimity. So we don't have to actually talk about values. We could just assert that there is unanimity. So that's, but there is an interesting problem that both Stigler and Friedman face, namely they make a distinction. This is not really, I don't emphasize it in this paper, between major values and minor values, and it's major values where there is going to be unanimity.
Right, but in the lecture isn't Friedman simply saying everyone agrees inflation's bad, unemployment's bad?
That's among the claims, yes, but in, for the purposes of the general picture, it doesn't really matter what the values are. What really matters is if you have a working society, then you can assume agreement over ends, including other ends like no hunger, families are great, etc. Okay, so this is what I'll do, but we'll come back to it, Andrew, because it's non-trivial. I'm going to offer some distinctions and some theses. I'm going to say a little bit more about Chicago economics because I know it gets people excited and riled up. Then I'll go back in time and I'll go to Sidgwick and to the father of the famous Keynes, and I'll do quite a bit of exegesis on them. As the experts know, this Keynes was beloved by Friedman and Stigler. They love citing him, so it also is a nice part of the story. Then I want to show the ways in which Stigler innovates over Keynes, and I'll show where this ends up, namely Harberger, and Ali, you guys show up in the paper as well. You're living history now. I don't know if that's a good thing. If you had stuck to the Tucker-Hube debate, I would not be talking about you. So there you go. When
just,
the carbon,
just for the record, Eric Maskin told me this about 20 years ago. He said, why do we do history of thought? Your work is history of thought.
Oh, there you go. There you go. When economics attempted to separate from philosophy, it deployed an image of science in which science is represented as a consensus-generating activity. This is crucial. This image of science recurs in economics and actually is also now extremely popular in philosophy of science. So there's actually a very interesting issue about this image. What I want to do is I want to trace the development of two core ideas in the context of the articulation of the distinction between science and philosophy, or positive and normative economics. I want to talk about the way in which science is thought of as a consensus-generating mechanism. And what's interesting is that initially, this picture is introduced with the thought that no agreement over value is to be expected. As time goes on, value unanimity is presupposed. That's really one major thing. The underlying message, this echoes what Scott's trying to do, is that philosophical ideas about science are deployed in economics in order to stabilize economics. You could say that in various sociological ways, in conceptual ways, and professional ways. That's the underlying message here. Which is why it's so amusing that whenever I come to the Summer Institute, we spend so much time talking about philosophy. Even I was used to think initially, oh, I come here to learn about economics.
Eric,
yeah?
Stabilize economics,
meaning creating a joint community, having shared standing with policymakers, having a shared standing with the public, having a powerful brand, if you want, and also rooting out dissent. That's the other part of it. Okay, so I'm just going to quickly go over this. Science is very important. Now, what I want to focus on is not what scientists really do, although most of my professional life is about that. Today, I want to talk about of images of science. And by that, I mean the talk about science in polemical context when you want to settle arguments, when you want to settle disputes. That tends to have its own life. Yes, that's what I'm really interested in. Okay, so an image of science is a list of characteristics that functions as shorthand for representing science. These characteristics are used in debates where at least one side relies on the epistemic and social authority of science, often accompanied by privileged lists of scientific virtues, often lots of tacit commitments about the nature of knowledge, nature of reality, nature of society, nature of science, right? This image kind of compresses a lot of complexity. A part of the task of philosophy of science is, in fact, to scrutinize this list. We don't do that very much, I feel. It's mostly farmed out to the sociology of knowledge. In practice, philosophy of science is not so reflexive, so it falls on people like me who do more historically informed philosophy of science. Okay, so what's an image of science in practice? More George. One of David's favorite passages. I don't know why it's so favored among you, but you love it. An extremist is an intellectual lunatic. He knew you by this time, right? Allowed loose if he does not communicate violence, but without an admission ticket to ordinary discourse. There's merit in excluding the lunatic from the discourse. Occasionally the lone dissenter with the absurd will prove to be right. Galileo was a better scheme of the universe. Babbage was a workable computer, right? The lunatics are great scientists. That's what's really interesting here. But if we gave each lunatic a full meticulous hearing, we should be wasting vast time and effort, right? So science presupposes considerable agreement. There's a cost-benefit argument for not responding to objections in science. There's a status quo bias, which helps classify which views are reasonable and which are not. Presupposes that scientific revolutions are possible, but no effort to incorporate systematic dissent into one's conception of science. What he doesn't do, and which is striking for Stigler, the economist, we don't get a comparative cost-benefit analysis of alternative institutions in science. I echo, of course, his famous presidential address, where comparative institutional analysis is what economics ought to be. So to put this in Ali Khan's terms, as a second-order theorist, I read your paper last night, Stigler doesn't conform to his own first-order ideals. And that's, I think, very interesting. Okay, this paper you all know ad nauseum. The preferable interpretation is that, I won't even, you know this passage. If values are agreed, this is for me the upshot, the technocrat can offer proposals without worrying about politics. That is for me the key insight of De Gustibus Non Est. And what it does is that conceptually it makes social engineering possible, this view. I'll come back and put some meat on that when I go to Harberger, but in a way, this paper really has it very cleanly laid out. Foucault has done marvelous work showing the prehistory of this in Becker. I'm a footnote to Foucault, a complicated footnote. Okay, so the technocratic political ideal echoes an image of science that places high value on consensus within science, and it's basically the Kuhnian picture. Interestingly enough, when Kuhn articulates that picture, he actually, economics is the science he talks about. One of the few places where he mentions it in structure, it may, for example, be significant that economists argue less about whether their field is a science than do practitioners of some other fields of social science, right? So this is part of the same conversation. Turns out, David called my attention to this. Kuhn and Stigler corresponded over this quite a bit. Stigler says to Kuhn, you think you're original, we got there first. We economists. We have this whole view of scientific revolutions already in the discipline. And I'm going to give you some evidence that Stigler is right. Different evidence that he himself offers in the letters. I've talked about this in the publication. Sorry for the self-promotion. Okay, so now we get to the meat of the paper. One nice way to think about the split between economics and philosophy is to focus on Cambridge in the late 19th century. I have other reasons for this than strictly economic. Sidgwick turns out to be the pivotal figure in philosophy's self-conception of what ethics ought to be. If you read Rawls, this becomes very, very clear. So I could tell the story through Mill and maybe even through Marshall, but Sidgwick really matters both for economics and for philosophy, and so he makes a nice person to focus on. Okay, so this is Sidgwick. I guess when he didn't go to the barber. The principle of political economy is written in the belief that the reaction above, described against the treatment of political economy as an established science, was inevitable and even salutary. But it has been carried too far, so that the waves of disputation are in danger of submerging the really sound and valuable results of previous thought. My primary aim then has been to eliminate unnecessary controversy. Okay, so despite apparent, even healthy disagreement, there's consensus in much of economics. This is late 19th century, right? Sidgwick will offer some distinctions in removing apparent disagreement. He seems to imply, too, that some disagreement is probably useful or unavoidable. And it's the role of the textbook author, and I think this is actually itself an interesting fact in the history of textbooking, to decide which disagreement is genuine and which is apparent. And if we think about how textbooks operate in science, I think that's a very important role for textbook authors. And it's possible, this I say as a hypothesis, that Sidgwick is really the first to have discerned this. We'd have to look at how chemistry and physics was taught in the 19th century. But in fact, I know that certainly physics was taught through disagreements. So it was very, I'll say this again in a second, it was very common to think in the late 19th century that disagreement was just a fact of life in physics. So I think he may be a genuine innovator, but this is for someone else to figure out at some point. Okay, in those parts of this work in which I've used chiefly deductive reasoning, I've made it my special aim to state explicitly and keep clearly in view the limited and conditional applicability of the conclusions obtained by it. With this view, I've been generally careful to avoid any dogmatic statements on practical points. Practical means applied. It is very rarely, if ever, that the practical economic questions which are presented to the statesman can be unhesitatingly decided by abstract reasoning from elementary principles. For the right solution of them, full and exact knowledge of the fact of the particular case is commonly required, and the difficulty of ascertaining these facts is often such as to prevent the attainment of positive conclusions by any strictly scientific procedure. Right, so important background thought that we all kind of inhabit, economics is in part a policy science. Ali, maybe primarily a policy science. But economic policy advice does not merely require deduction from foundational economic theory to particular consequences, but also knowledge of relevant local facts. This is elementary, but it's useful to keep in mind. So while there's consensus among experts over economic theory, there would be more consensus over policy advice if all the relevant facts were known. And indeed, governments start collecting massive amounts of data in order to facilitate this. Right? I'm not saying that it's Sidgwick's role in this, but it's no coincidence that with this picture of economics, data gathering starts to become big. Okay, it must, yeah, you really need me. It must be obvious, however, as soon as it is pointed out that the investigation of the laws that determine actual prices, wages, and profits, so far as these depend on the free competition of individuals, is essentially distinct from the inquiry how far it is desirable that the action of free competition should be restrained or modified. So far as the purely scientific economist studies primarily the results that tend to be produced by perfectly free competition, it is not because he has any predilection for this order of things, for science knows nothing of such preferences, but merely because its greater simplicity renders it easier to grasp. Notice the simplicity claim here. Okay. He holds that a knowledge of these simpler relations precedes, in the order of study, the investigation of more complex economic problems that result from competition modified by disturbing causes. Marshall and Smith are in the background here in very nice ways. But the adoption of a perfectly free competition as a scientific ideal, a means of simplifying economic facts which actual society presents, for the convenience of general reasoning, does not imply its adoption as a practical ideal, which a statesman or philanthropist ought to aim at realizing as completely as possible. Okay, so philosophically, it's all fairly straightforward. There's a sharp division between pure scientific economics, which involves consensus, and practical economics, which involves hypothetical inferences from first principles of facts, which is to be implemented by the statesmen and philanthropists. As I mentioned, the fact that consensus is a regulative ideal in science is not the only norm in the 19th century. So if you read Duhem or Boltzmann or Mach or even Maxwell, you can see very different pictures of what an image of science could be like. Okay, so this view gets inscribed in, as Stigler noted, by Robbins. I'm not going to read the whole text for you. It's in the paper. I love this business. If we disagree about ends, it's a case of die, blood, or mine, or live and let live according to the importance of the difference or the relative strength of our opponents, right? And actually, Friedman echoes this in the Positive Economics paper. And I'll get to that in a second. Right, so I assume in this audience everybody knows the Robbins piece. There's an intellectual division of labor. Economists discuss means, and that's where consensus is. And he actually understands economics as a conflict resolution mechanism. I think that's a deep point in Robbins. Philosophers, by contrast, discuss ends, and that's where there's disunity, potentially violently so. Right? So there's not really a sharp division of labor between economics and philosophy. It turns out that Robbins actually has a modest aim for scientific economics, and not unsurprisingly given the context, but it turns economics into a species of engineering, searching for the best means with given ends. And in this audience, I don't need to remind you that Buchanan was a great critic of this perspective. The word catalactics, I've only heard at George Mason, and now I'm going to say it at Richmond too. But I think it's a great word, no idea what it means, but, you know. But it sounds really cool. Okay, so this is John Neville Keynes, who wrote what I think of as the first English language philosophy of economics book, The Scope and Method of Political Economy. There's a lot of very interesting things to be said about Cambridge in the late 19th century. David has done very important pioneering work on the overlap between logicians and economists in this period. I've already mentioned Marshall, Sidgwick, this Keynes, Keynes' son, of course, but Ramsey shows up. Johnson, the logician / economist, is there. It's a very fertile period. And the rise of analytic philosophy and the rise of professional mathematical economics have a beautiful overlap in Cambridge in this period. That history still needs to be written, maybe by you. There's a further reason why positive science of political economy should receive distinct and independent recognition. With the advance of knowledge, it may be possible to come to a general agreement in regard to what is or what may be in the economic world, sooner than any similar agreement is attainable in regard to the rules by which economics of individuals and communities should be guided. The former requires only that there is something to the facts. The latter may be prevented by conflicting ideals as well as by divergent views to the actual or the possible. Notice the focus on modality, David. It is not, however, the function of the science to pass ethical judgments. Right? So this all sounds very straightforward. If economics becomes a distinct positive science, we can expect consensus to emerge quicker. For facts once established, not controversial, and he introduces the famous terminology. There's no expectation to have consensus over aims or ends. No surprise, and I'm putting my nod to Max Weber in, given large pluralistic societies and the vision of labor, the consensus view in this period is you can't expect consensus over values given the different types of interests around. Normative economics or applied ethics is the body of systemized knowledge relating to criteria of what ought to be. It's about the ideal as distinguished from the actual, and it consists of judgments. In the paper, I say quite a bit more about this, and I'm related to Sidgwick's first order views about what judgments are and what ethics is. So if you're interested in the details, that's where the paper itself has a lot more stuff. No expectation over agreement over the possible. That's a bit of a surprise. I just raised this as a comment because it seems to assume that economic regularities and laws cannot be projected into the future. Not sure what to make of this. And then there's, of course, the art of economics, the systematic rules for the attainment of given policy. So normative projects should be kept outside economics. That's really the main upshot of Keynes' view. Again, I don't think what I said is controversial. What I think gets interesting is shortly hereafter. So Keynes also inscribes into his book an image of science, and this hasn't received much attention. It is also true, as the Austrian economist Menger has remarked, that sciences have been created and revolutionized by those who've not stopped to analyze their own method of inquiry, right? So this notion of scientific revolutions is fully present in Keynes's thoughts, and in fact is a kind of trope in the period too. Now Menger, this I don't need to say here, Keynes reports that Menger was familiar enough with the concept of a scientific revolution. In fact, in the remark attributed to Menger, Menger recognized both the establishment of sciences and their intermittent revolutions. Why do I do this to myself? Okay, this we know. Obligatory mention of Adam Smith, history of astronomy, and we know Menger read this, so I mean there's a nice historical pathway too. Okay, so the key point is this, again familiar enough, but it's nice to see how it gets inscribed into this distinction between positive and nominative economics. Keynes thinks of economics as a less mature science than say physics and astronomy, or less definitive. For Keynes relies on the idea that a science develops through different stages, including a descriptive or classificatory stage before reaching an ultimate or definitive or deductive stage. This idea of stages of economics remains very powerful in economics through the debates over the Coles Commission. So if you go look at the referee reports of Friedman on Coles and Weiner, Koopman's debate, you see this language of more and less mature economic science show up on all sides of the debate. Okay, so there's both development of primitive to mature science over time and revolutions between mature theories over time. These two images are both present. Why is the font so small? Can you read this? If political economy, regarded from the theoretical standpoint, is to make good progress, I like the idea of good progress rather than bad progress. It is essential that all extrinsic or premature sources of controversy should be eliminated. I mean, he's a Cambridge Don, so he says it differently. Sorry about that. And we may be sure that the more of its principles are discussed independently of ethical and practical considerations, the sooner will the science emerge from a controversial stage. The intrusion of ethics into economics can but multiply and perpetuate sources of disagreements. Right, so we really want to get going on the road to progress. So good scientific progress is itself characterized as of moving from an immature controversial stage to a mature stage. I think he's taking stuff from Sidgwick and making it a lot more precise. And so for me, the key move here is not the distinction between normative and positive economics. The key move is to use that description and inscribe it, or inscribe into it, an image of science, which has this notion of immature to mature and temporal revolutions in time of these matures. That's what's key. And that's attractive to those economists that A, want to get on with their research and sell the fruits to others, as well as to people like me who are enamored by the idea, well, I'm a political scientist now, so I don't know what to say anymore, by those strange philosophers who are enamored by the idea that they're experts of ethical matters and that they can have an agenda for us. If you think of the idea of experts in ethical matters as crazy, think of people like Peter Singer, who present themselves as experts of ethical matters, and there's a whole industry, some of my best friends are in it, in bioethics, medical ethics, business ethics, etc. Right? So this idea has taken off very well and has insulated philosophy in the various economic depressions from elimination by business people who don't like humanities. I hope that's on record. Keynes does not reflect on the difficulties with the idea of making theoretical positive economics independent of ethical judgments. He just doesn't, as far as I know, doesn't talk about that. And I think that's a real limitation of the book, which is otherwise really very interesting. Granted that if there is a fact-value distinction, then one can make the concepts that are meant to track the facts and their generalizations purely factive without either presupposing or tacitly deploying various ethical judgments. But that this distinction really works turns out to be really very hard to establish. Quick overview, from 1920 to 1970, consensus within philosophy was this is a sharp distinction, starting in the analytic tradition with Putnam, but of course in Frankfurt, others have already said it. That consensus is now gone in philosophy. Very few people are willing to accept that distinction. Interestingly enough, when philosophers talk to economists, they discover that the distinction is still very well accepted. Now, one way to generate science is to eliminate dissent. That's also one byproduct of Keynes's position. It's not, I think, his own preferred way of going, but you don't have to be a brain scientist to notice this. Okay, so Stigler, going back and sort of almost wrapping up, in 1933, uses and reorients Keynes's distinctions. At the level of economic policy, then, it is totally misleading to talk of ends as individual and random, as new welfare theorists do. That's, in fact, a very interesting claim, this notion of randomness. I won't explore it later today. But Arrow, in his famous, what's it, Economic Review, Chuck? Where did it appear? In his famous... Yeah, I think that's where it is. 1951, Arrow has a very important survey article in which he discusses uncertainty and misses Stigler's observations here for non-trivial reasons. But it turns out that there's a whole afterlife, a whole pre-life to thinking about economic behavior as random. Arrow attributes the idea to Alcuin, but which is great, but turns out the story is more complicated. If this, that was an aside. If this conclusion be accepted, and accepted we must, the economist may properly exceed the narrow confines of economic analysis. Properly exceed. He may cultivate a second discipline. Whatever happened to the division of labor? We're now experts in two. The determination of the ends of his society, particularly relevant to economic policy. This discipline may be called, following Keynes, applied ethics. I'll let Schliesser have the last word. I did not realize how neglected this excellent book has become until when I recently referred to it. Several friends expressed surprise that I didn't know Keynes' middle name was Maynard. I think Friedman makes a joke like this somewhere too. So the Chicago folk really love this fact. Okay, so Keynes is the authority that helps us distinguish between positive and normative economics. But rather than outsourcing policy, economists should master it too. Why did I do this? Oh, yeah. There's no expectation that the determination of the ends of a society, particularly relevant to economic policy, will be disunified. Rather, Schliesser says, appealing to Parsons and Max Weber, actually, in all kinds of interesting ways, consensus is possible. And here comes the move that I already mentioned to Andrew before. It is quite another thing to conclude, therefore, ends of good policy are beyond the realm of scientific discussion. For surely the primary requisite of a working social system is a consensus on ends. In context, very clear, he's talking about Dalke Parsons here. The individual members of society must agree, and also in the lectures, the 5 lectures at LSE, he develops this line. So LSE has been mentioned again. Must agree upon the major ends which that society is to seek. If any large share of the population actively disagrees with society ends, and in particular if it believes that the system is unfair by the group's criteria, the social system will surely, notice this surely, disintegrate, probably with violence. This is almost axiomatic in modern social theory. So, if a society is peaceful enough, normative economics can assume consensus. Monens, ponens, tolens, right? Now, Friedman makes this move famous. Won't need to, and indeed, Keynes is the authority here. Now, Friedman's point is primarily to give legitimacy and methodology of positive economics, but he also thinks that the normative project can be a science too. Okay, so just one thing about the Friedman paper. Positive economics is in principle independent of any particular ethical position or normative judgment. He also denies the existence of fundamental differences in basic values. Perfect. That I call the Schliesser move. We know that they were corresponding over this, so I think I could say that. But interestingly enough, in Friedman, and which makes the Schilly Nobel lecture so tragic, is in 53, he relativizes the Schliesser move to disinterested citizens and circumstances prevailing in the Western world, and especially in the United States. So Friedman 53 actually has a kind of Millian or Smithian or Marshallian picture of the evolution of social systems, where this move becomes relativized only to one particular kind of society. He forgets that later to his own, I think, tragedy. So you can only assume consensus locally. And that follows from this that you just can't export economic theories to other places. This is my nod to Deirdre's ongoing assertion that Friedman was very cautious about exporting economic theories to other places. This is not the day to resolve my disagreement with Deirdre. Okay, so Friedman too echoes Robbins and Schliesser. Differences in basic values can cause men to fight. So if a society is relatively peaceful, you could still assume consensus. I'll close with the following 2 thoughts. So this is really, economics is now set up to become a technocratic policy science. Where that leads, I think, is best exemplified by Harberger's work. kind of a homage to my 15 years at the Summer Institute. This paper is intended as a tract that three basic postulates be accepted as providing a conventional framework for applied welfare economics. When evaluating the net benefits of costs of a given action, project, program, or policy, the costs and benefits accruing to each member of the relevant unit, that should normally be added without regard to the individuals to whom they accrue. The need for an accepted set of professional standards to this type of study should be obvious. Just as the road construction standards that a team of highway engineers must meet can be checked by other highway engineers. It's kind of Polanyian commitment here. So the exercise in applied welfare economics carried out by one team of economists should be subject to check by others. Right? So there's an image here of a shared intellectual inquiry where experts can judge each other's recommendations and come to conclusions over them. I'll say a little bit more. What I really find fascinating about it is that applied welfare economics should be, in terms developed by others, a communicative community with consensus qua expertise. That's really key, and Harberger is really very self-conscious about it. In effect, when economists provide policy advice, they can assume consensus over ends, in effect treat the state as an individual, and as everybody here knows, ignore distributional effects. Some of you have written much better on this. Key then is economists can be social engineers if they're paymasters and the rulers wants it. One reason to focus on Chicago and all of this is that in the self-image of Chicago, they're quasi-libertarians, and they don't like social engineering, right? So if I'd done all of this for Samuelson, there ought to have been a yawn. But the fact is, this is what I think of as the technocratic consensus in mainstream economics. And Chicago has become part of that by the 70s. Make a point, David and Sandy and DeMartino have made, unlike engineers or medical doctors, no really good code of ethics involved. We philosophers are no better than the economists in this respect and suffer for it. There's another image of science. This is the best picture I could find of you, Ali. And I'm now really looking for the hippie picture with you in long hair that I'm sure must be circulating somewhere. So there's another image of science that some other day, hopefully, I can talk more about. Economic theorizing represents a double movement from reality to model to reality. Each such movement represents a compromise, and it makes little sense to me to search for a decompromise. The fundamental problem is that in order to approach the real world, you need to introduce complexity. Okay, so several issues to be set. There's a technical critique of Harberger in the paper I'm quoting about, where basically the argument is the results are not robust. And that sort of implies that the ideal that Harberger appeals to requires extra means to be put in place in practice, because the technology, the consensus-generating technology, doesn't give what you want without extra scientific commitments. We could talk about that some other time. Other important point is that the judgments involved in facilitating this double movement are not made transparent, either in Harberger's technique deployed, nor in the ways the result of the double movement are presented to policy clients. I think there's been a lot of good work recently on how economists should present their findings to make much more transparent the layers of uncertainty that go into any number. So I think there's hope that there's been some progress. In conclusion, philosophy of science and the images of science has played a non-trivial role in constructing the economist's image of what their science is. Some images of science helped establish the distinctions between what is properly economics and what is outside of economics, and these images of science evolved to accommodate more ambitious tasks for economics. I'll stop there.
Yes, very interesting, and I must be one of the few people who also know the 43 paper.
Oh, excellent. Have you written on it?
I've written on Stigler far too much.
I'd love to read what you wrote on this paper.
Well, I consider it very much under the influence of Knight, that paper.
Fair enough.
And-
Yeah, continue.
Yeah, and that once you get into the post-Montpellier Stigler and look at his work, he's really making a break, but that's beside.
No, that's not beside, because I think we really disagree here. I think that what I call the Stigler move
Yeah.
is what the modern, so there's this, for those of you who don't know, there's this whole debate, Chicago to evolution, 2 Chicagos, 3 Chicagos, and Knight's kind of the hero of the old Chicago. But I want to claim that 43, the Stigler 43, has already made a key step away from Knight. And I think you can see this very clearly. I've actually written like 5 blogs about this, but not a journal article yet. You could see that Knight in late 30s in the ethics and economics papers really doesn't want to go down this move. And Stigler, who like Knight is a good student of Parsons, says, ha, this move is key. So I think 43 is already something different than Knight's position.
Well,
Just because Stigler quotes a lot of ancient authors and is very learned in the paper doesn't mean he agrees with Knight. That's really what I want to claim.
well, maybe, but I'd still say there's this heavy Knight thrust to the paper that Stigler would not write that paper 20 years later.
Now, that we agree about. So I think
Okay.
there is a genuine evolution.
It's basically, we're just arguing about exactly when.
Well, so I think one of the really big messages here is that the reigning consensus among historians of economics about 2 Chicagos, that story doesn't really work if you look at the details of the late 1930s and 40s. I think the story is much more complicated than
No,
than
I'd
that.
agree. But
Okay,
my
good.
actual question, before
Good.
I got sidelined, is Stigler on policy.
Uh-huh.
Okay, Friedman claimed, Stigler claimed that the difference between Stigler and Friedman was that Stigler didn't believe that economists should provide policy advice. That's what they claim. Now, I'm not saying that he didn't,
Yeah.
but that's what they claim. Now, in fact,
I think what Stigler really says is you shouldn't trust the economist who makes policy advice.
he said that, but he said no further, I think, if you look at Stigler. That is not the role, as opposed to Friedman, it's not the role
Okay, yes, good.
to do that. Okay, but I want to look at the problem he tackled near the end of his career. And it's one good illustration is one of the article that's published after his death, Law or Economics. And there he actually says, as part of what he was wrestling with at the end of his life, well, look at something like the sugar, sugar tariff, right? The protection. Economists really can't have anything to say about that. If, in fact, there is the test of time, if it's simply there for years and years, it simply reflects consumer sovereignty. That's what the public wants. Economists really have nothing to say about that because consumer preferences lead, right? That's what we believe in. So that, in fact, I'm sort of dubious about Stigler's position on policy. So I'd like your comments on that.
I think I can accommodate your view because the role that Stigler has in my project is not to say that he's the advocate of social engineering, right? The role in my project is to make clear that, regardless of his own views on what the economists should say to politicians, and we agree it's complicated, I think he plays a complicated double game here. We don't have to go all the way down Murawski and Eddie Nicka's route to see that Stigler had quite ambitions for the business school and all that. But for me, what's key is the conceptual move, namely where he flips Parsons' insight into, well, if there's no violence, you can assume consensus. And that opens up locally the possibility for social engineering. That's really what I'm interested in. I'm not a judge of other people's roles in the world. I'm really today interested in what are the conceptual moves. And that's, for me, there Stigler plays an unacknowledged role, in part because the historiography insists that 43, it's Knightian. And so that's why I'm saying, no. You really want to make really close attention to the details. Through the late 30s, Knight saying no consensus, no consensus. For good reason, because there is no consensus. And Stigler says, okay, let's do one person's modem ponens, another person's modem stolens, and we'll flip it. And so I think that's what's key.
I just had one quick add-on about the Knight-Stigler influence thing. I think that Stigler has moved beyond Knight in some ways here, but he hasn't totally disentangled himself, because the disinterested phrase is a total Knight thing. Knight is harping constantly on the only valid judgments that can be valid are done by disinterested individuals and experts within that context even.
Good. So I didn't expect to be talking so much about Knight, but I will add one footnote to that. So your point's well taken. And in fact, there's also the famous passage from the Nicomachean Ethics that frames the discussion in the piece. That too is a nod to Knight, but it's also a running critique of Knight. Because really, I think there's a very complicated literary joke here. It's Aristotle criticizing Plato and Socrates on the relationship between experts and society. And I view Stigler as saying to Knight, you are playing Socrates, we can't do that. Okay, so I think there's a hidden discussion here that's not transparent to people that don't know the classics.
Just a couple of quick things. I was really struck when I read your paper about a couple points you referred to, what professional economists can take from this. And I think strictly speaking, what jumps out is that economists aren't really, they are scientists, not professionals. If we think of the professional as someone who serves someone outside the guild, what this argument speaks to is the way in which economists think of themselves as scientists who serve only the guild, and no professional ethics is required, beyond just sort of the ordinary ethics of scientific practice.
I'm very pleased you picked up that strain in the paper. So thank you.
Well, and the other thing, I got to thinking about textbooks, and I appreciated your comment about Sidgwick, which opens up an interesting paper as it connects to Samuelson, who famously says, "I don't care who writes the nation's laws as long as I can write its textbooks." And you also mentioned offhand, that a lot of this is about branding of economics, and Samuelson and I mean, it's very much about the image of scientific maturity that's being projected. If there is unanimity within the profession supposedly about these, the perfect competition model or whatever we think defines the science, and if we can project that in our textbooks and persuade the public that we're all on the same page, then it helps to create the very thing that they presume from the beginning. Anyway.
Just a small comment on that. So I learned the significance of textbooks from David and Sandy, and I can recommend anybody their work on this. I have two companion papers to this. One a short one by a criticism of Joseph Cropsey on Samuelson that just came out, and the longer one that I'm willing to circulate, where I tackle the Samuelson side of the story much more directly. For a long time, I felt intimidated by the Samuelson edifice, so I've been working my way towards really tackling it. But in the last year, I've done a lot of work on it, and I think you're discerning where I'm heading with this.
Ali's comments really resonated with me about the complexity as opposed to the consensus. One is about the facts. one statement is that once facts are established, there is consensus. Well, what facts we look at and how we look at those facts are very value-laden. They cannot agree about the impact of the Obama stimulus package, for example, and the supply-siders and Keynesians interpret the results according to their worldviews. Similarly,
Can I interrupt you there, and then we
Sure.
just cut it up? So, what you just said represented the shared consensus of philosophers of science between 1960 and about 1995, give or take. And it was the kind of stuff I was educated in. Recently, philosophers of science have been really eager to disassociate facts from theories. And so while the conclusion, I think, is still valid, I would have to offer a much more circuitous argument to the same conclusion. And my current way of doing that, this is in a paper on Chile and Friedman and Chicago. My current claim is that whenever you start aggregating facts in the social sphere, value commitments are inevitable. So how you cluster facts always is going to require something else, and that something else need not be theory, but can be, you know, normative commitments in various ways. So that gets the same result, but without the theory-ladenness assumption, because that's now less kosher than it was 20 years ago.
and a second comment is about, again, consensus of ideas and eliminating dissent, what that means. I mean, these Chicago economists who are basically built on the perfectly competitive model, which I don't have objections to, but they eliminate the free competition of ideas, basically. And how this is established is supported by the scientific community. Which kind of research gets published, which kind of research gets funded, determines or continues the supposed stability in the proportion, in the profession, and slows down progression that can come from the incorporation of dissent. And another way of establishing consensus is by authoritarian regimes, really.
Yes.
Not just underlying consensus of values.
So I'm a member of, actually helped found the Complex Sciences Institute at Ghent. I'm their philosophic trophy figure. It's mostly computer modelers. But one of the things we're mostly modeling stability of financial systems under shock, you know, all that stuff. But one of the things we're also modeling when the computers have some memory left over is how to think of evolution of different kind of scientific communities in agent-based models. And so we're trying to figure out strictly endogenously how to think about progress in various ways and how to think about optimal scientific institutional design. So I think there are actually very interesting modeling questions here that one day I'm sure will be abused by technocratic engineers who will do the incentives on us. Yes, there's a humongous field of sociology of knowledge that addresses the kind of concerns you want to make. One reason I enjoyed writing this paper is to show that the ideal that you've ascribed to Chicago is in fact already fully present in the way that Sidgwick sets up the textbook, right? So the perfect free market is the one that we're going to study together as the simple one. And it's by no means obvious that that's the simplest basic model, right? I mean, you can easily think of other simple models to discuss an economy. So I think that's also, in a way, part of the DNA. And I think one thing that I've generally been interested in is to flip the valence. There's a tendency to say, Chicago, by critics, it all went downhill from there. But what I really think what makes the 20th century interesting is that Chicago, in many ways, was channeling what was already present and became part of a very broad consensus. So, you know, I don't think of, what's my favorite bogeyman at Harvard these days?
Mankiw?
Yes. I don't think of Mankiw at all as a Chicago economist, at all. But everything I've said applies to him too. Right, so I think the only reason I use Chicago for the story is because Stigler is a very good writer and he's very reflexive about these issues. And because it's nice to say, hey, this is not about left versus right. It's not about Keynes versus Friedman. This is what the vast majority of the discipline can rally around. And that's why I use Chicago for these purposes. So in a way, I agree with you on the substance, actually. But for my purposes, I can take that off the table.
Okay, 2 comments and a question. My first comment is that I really enjoyed your paper.
Oh, thank you.
It seems to me that a nice complement to the history that you tell would be a theory of scientific belief formation as complex phenomenon. I just wonder where that might come from.
Yes.
How that might be developed. My second comment is that, again, I really enjoy your paper, but it seems as though it only tells maybe, you might say, 2/3 of the historical story, and that what's missing is the Viennese part of the story. So my question is, can you maybe fill in some of that story and you know, how Viennese philosophy of science links up with Cambridge and Chicago in virtue of people like Robbins and Hutchison and Hayek? And can you also maybe explain why that part of the story is not told here? Doesn't
okay,
figure in your
so I'll do the second question first and the second. So my first paper on Chicago is on Milton Friedman and Carnap, basically. So I think of the story that I told is in part can be inserted into what I'll call a soft neo-Kantianism that emanates from Vienna, but also from Weber, etc. But it's also an image you find in Pareto. There's a kind of spotlight image of facts. Which facts do you see? That's dependent on the background theory in your classification system. That runs through the technical side of this discussion. I've discussed that in other papers, so I wasn't really motivated to do that. But I also think that there's been mistaken post-1960 historiography. So I think there's been a tendency to give Popper and the Viennese too much credit in the development of these ideas. So not that I don't think what happened in Vienna was very important and interesting, but one reason why I start the story with Neville Keynes is to show that the relevant Viennese ideas were already part of the larger intellectual culture. And I've also learned that Friedman was exceedingly nice to his interlocutors and would basically tell them late in life, "You're so great." And he's done that to me too, so I feel like, you know. So I think it's important to get Hayek into the story, fuller story. But for me, what?
Carl became Menger as well.
Oh yeah, and Menger was in there today, but I also have to say that for this technocratic image that I want to put my finger on, what makes the Hayek and Menger parts interesting, they're really interesting as contrast, I think. So, you know, I mentioned today one of history's temporary losers, Ali Khan, but of course I could have mentioned other historical temporary losers in these debates. And so, but yeah, if I ever write a book, I'll add more complexity. On the first part, just to say quickly, and this is an idea that John Davis and I guess Murawski also have done. What's interesting about the picture of science here is that belief formation becomes something automatic. It becomes something magical, and there's no cognitive complexity in this image of science qua scientist. And so you put your finger on something very important. I think that in the background are ideas of cybernetics and computers and Jevons and his stuff, that are kind of lurking there. I'm not very good at that material, but I think you're right. And I also would ping pong that question back to you when you do your own game, Hayekian modeling. Thanks, yeah. Okay, sure.
Yeah, just a comment more than a question, because I'd like to kind of maybe turn this thing on its head.
Okay.
That the separation of economics and ethics has impoverished both sides of the separation. The technocratic economics that and its evolution that you're talking about here is the sort of the effect of trying to develop a sort of an ethics-free economics. But I think that there's also a downside of having an economics-free ethics. And I'm reminded of Kenneth Boulding's presidential address to the American Economic Association, where he talks about economics as a moral science. And he tries to develop the point that the relationship between the two is a two-way street. And in terms of the insights that economics might helpfully offer to ethics, he cites the development of aggregate quantitative measures such as GDP per capita, and he also cites the use of benefit cost analysis in that context. Examples that I'm thinking of specifically, we recently came out with 169 Sustainable Development Goals, and philosophers, environmental philosophers and political philosophers talk about things like a right to a green future. Without any, these things are completely sort of innocent of any economic considerations in the situation, that there's no attempt to prioritize or to suggest that there might be trade-offs between these goals and how to evaluate those trade-offs. I just want to, basically I just wanted to bring Boulding's point back into play here, that that economics, even the technocratic side of economics, perhaps does have a positive role to play in trying to sort out ethical problems.
Yeah, so I blogged about this, and we agree, but I think the Boulding's position is not stable either.
Nice presentation. I have a quick point. One thing that struck me about the presentation was this point about the idea of consensus in Neville Keynes and Sidgwick and Marshall, this idea of consensus as a validator of the discipline's scientific pedigree. Now, that reminded me, of course, of Mirowski's idea that economics was trying to make itself comparable to physics, and then you said, well, but in physics, consensus was not thought to be a condition of scientificness.
Yeah.
And I'm assuming that biology, it was not the same. Maybe in chemistry it was, because you had to have practical results. So I just wanted to get your take on that, what seems to me to be a little paradox.
You can understand Schliesser as taking Mirowski's best ideas and trying to give them their due, but also to strip some of what I think of naivete of Mirowski's philosophy of physics, which is, again, paradoxical for me to say. Because I think his history of physics that he relies on is really textbook history of physics, and therefore not really attentive to some of the details that I'd like him to be attentive to. But he put the issues on the agenda, and all respect to it. But I think you've picked up on an important strain there. Yeah.
One of the things in John Neville Keynes' book that I think has been overlooked is his concern about the economist as advocate. And then if I read it correctly, everything breaks down if you've got an economist as advocate because you're going to force the results. And so that the inattention to incentives on J.N. Keynes's account is a disaster. And I think that this is amplifies your concern about the fact that we don't have a code of ethics, because in lots of places it's the code of ethics and somehow enforced is a way that the advocacy rule is, if not blocked, at least made transparent.
Yes, so the way I handled this issue in the paper is that you're channeling your inner Tulloch, and I like that. But the way I handled that issue in the paper is to point out that for Sidgwick and for Keynes, the self-command of the scientist qua scientist is really very important. So there is an implied ethos, a shared ethos with Protestant 19th century culture, and a shared ethos with a Baconian picture of science where the scientist is in self-command that runs through Keynes's argument, so that he can allow himself not to focus either on the incentives or on a genuine code of ethics. But obviously, that turned out to be rather naive. So this, I mean, so it's, I think it's the status of Keynes is interesting. It's a really interesting book. But unlike other books that I've tried to resurrect, you do have a sense that he's not fully in control of all the possible moves that might be relevant to the situation. So I think there's also good reasons to understand why the book became obscure again, despite its 50-year thing.
Very short comment, Rob, and then
One
George.
sentence. So on that point, has virtue been crowded out or just redefined?
Well, so I think that's this paper is a contribution to Oxford Handbook on Ethics and Virtue. I think it's been. I think the answer is both, but it's a complicated story.
George.
I guess we're out of time, so just a quick point. I wonder if you've overstated the extent of consensus in Rawls as substantive consensus as opposed to, say, Stigler. That is being presumed by them. I mean, after the theory of justice, Rawls clarified that he wasn't presuming overlapping comprehensive doctrines. He was looking for a way to organize, to think about an organization of liberal society that did not presume shared comprehensive doctrines and that presumed plurality and even disagreement, quite sharp disagreement over fundamental issues. So you have Rawls in there in passing toward the end, but when I read it, I wasn't sure whether he actually fits in the way that you've got him here.
Yes, so that's a very good question. For the people who haven't read the paper, it will also be obscure, but I'll answer it straight up. I think we have to be always cautious with when people explain later what they intended earlier. And I think this is one case. It's possible to read theory of justice as not having some kind of comprehensive commitments. But when you think about the range of possible institutional organizations that are being considered, we're in the realm of liberal institutions, right? So there is, in fact, a very non-trivial background consensus. The key point I make in the paper is to show that Rawls offers us a decision procedure that doesn't fall victim to over-precise mathematization, but still gives us the consensus we want, and does so through a kind of rational agent, or what's the economic term? The representative agent theory. That's a way to understand Rawls. I certainly agree that political liberalism and later Rawls, he backs down on some of the claims that I kind of tacitly attribute to theory of justice. This paper doesn't develop the full argument. The companion paper on the displacement of uncertainty in economics has a kind of cut and paste version of this argument, but I add a couple of paragraphs to kind of prevent these criticisms. But the point you make is one that I think any good reader of Rawls ought to make, and I agree that this paper doesn't deliver all the goods.
I think this discussion, or these discussions, will continue throughout the day. Thanks very much, Eric.
Thank you.